Many see progress and environmental protection as competing priorities, where one must always be chosen over the other. At ELOS, we see things differently. We see a partnership, a balance between improving the quality of our lives and preserving the places we call home. Our services make it possible for projects to move forward while also ensuring that they comply with all laws and regulations, that sensitive wetlands are not damaged or destroyed, that endangered species and habitats are protected, and that invaluable cultural resources are preserved for future generations. This is where we live, where we play, where we raise our families. We strive for a brighter future, but remain committed to the lands we love. ELOS, where natural environments and human interests intersect.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we'll be discussing strategies for minimizing wetland mitigation costs. My name is Bud Faust. I'm the marketing coordinator at ELOS Environmental. Just a couple of small housekeeping items before we start. First of all, we are recording the presentation. It will be available within the next couple days for replay on our YouTube channel. If you want to watch it again or share with a colleague or anyone you think would benefit from the information. Also, we will be taking questions, but at the end of the presentation, you can submit questions through the chat box, and you can submit them at any time during the presentation, but we won't be addressing questions until the end of the presentation. So with that, thank you again for joining us today, and I will turn you over to our presenter, Mr. Corey Ricks.
How y'all doing today? Corey Ricks here at ELOS, President of Business Development. Thank you all for joining us today to talk about an exciting topic here, trying to reduce some costs in your mitigation when impacting wetlands. So we're going to talk about some different strategies and things. So thank you all again for joining us. First off, ELOS Environmental, some of y'all don't know who we are. We were founded in 2006 by two entrepreneurs out of Tangipahoa Hall Parish. Started out as like a mom and pop shop doing wetland delineations, permitting, and now we do a wide range of environmental type consulting services, anything from permitting, cultural resources, GIS, mapping, and others, phase one environmental site assessments. There's a little bit of information about me. I've been at ELOS for about 8.5 years. Started out as a field tech here, was overall field operations, and now run the business development team. So mitigation, what is mitigation, and why is it required? So mitigation is whenever we're impacting jurisdictional features, whether it be from the Clean Water Act jurisdiction, Clean Water Act Section 404, or whether it be jurisdiction from maybe a state regulatory authority. If we're impacting those features, mitigation is where you're offsetting your impact to that. If we impact an acre of jurisdictional wetlands, we need to replace that wetland somewhere else within the same watershed. So that's essentially what mitigation means. So you can see here, there's, as I said, you have state and federal permitting agencies involved. For the purpose here, we'll kind of talk about Louisiana. I think most of y'all are familiar in Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana. We have the Corps of Engineers, New Orleans District. They regulate Section 404 wetlands in this area, as well as Section 10 Rivers and Harbors Act waters. But then you also have Louisiana Department of Natural Resources, who they have regulatory authority over coastal wetlands. So sometimes you have some overlap of mitigation requirements between those two agencies. And it's like that throughout the country. You may have different regulatory bodies that you have to appease when you're dealing with mitigation. So what needs a permit? Any action that you are going to impact a jurisdictional feature, whether it be a wetland or a water body. what is the permit process? I'm sure a lot of y'all are familiar with that, but essentially you're proposing what your plan is to the agency if you know that you're going to impact something, what your project design plan is, some of the features that may be involved with it, and how you're going to impact those jurisdictional features. So what factors play to approval and denial? Um, so this is a weird question that I get sometimes with a lot of my clients. Is the Corps going to deny this, or are they going to be able to prove this? The Corps or other regulatory agencies are not out here to just deny any permit that they see. They want infrastructure projects to move forward, but we want to, part of the Clean Water Act, the reason why it's there is to to prevent the overkill of impacting wetlands across the country. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for human interest. So that's the whole reason that is there. So they're willing to work with you on your projects. So whenever you first start out a permit project or your design of whatever you're doing, whether it be infrastructure type project or roadway bridge, it may be a utility project, development, something like that. The original design that you may have, it may have some changes throughout that permitting process. And the reason why we're doing that, you may be able to minimize some of your impacts, and the Corps may recognize that, or some of the agencies may recognize that. And so, it may not go in exactly how you planned at the very beginning, due to some of those factors. So there's three key factors to consider when we're talking about reducing your cost and mitigation. And it goes in this order here: avoidance, minimization, and compensatory mitigation. So avoidance, think about avoidance as from the very beginning stages of you figuring out what you want to do. Site selection is probably the most important uh, process that you can have in reducing your mitigation cost. Um, you know, a lot of times I'll say this with a lot of our clients, we get involved in a process, and the process typically after the sites are already identified. And so we're coming in past the avoidance stage. I think it would save people a lot of money and time, if they really think about site selection prior to, implementing their project or engaging in an engineer or a surveyor or anything like that. You know, Towards the end, you may have something that you may have had a chance to look at a different site that had less impactful and impacts to jurisdictional features. So, I think it's a very important process, site selection, engaging in a consultant that understands this process at the very beginning can save you a lot of money in the long run. Minimization. So minimization, think about this as after you've already selected this site. Now, how am I going to design my project around those ecological features that may, impact wetlands. And they may not be avoidable, right? Certain projects that are water dependent type projects, such as like a boat marina or something like that, or a drainage type feature, that you're going to have some wetland impacts or water impacts. So minimizing that is the best that you can do to try to save some money there. If you're talking about some sort of development like a subdivision or something like that, design your subdivision, your lot sizes, and some of your roadways around those features is the best way to try to minimize your impacts. Then the last thing, and this should typically really be seen from as a last resort type of situation, compensatory mitigation. So that's where we know that we're going to impact these wetlands. We need to replace it in kind, same habitat type within the same watershed. And that can really drive up the cost of a project. Mitigation is not cheap. That's one of the reasons why we want to do this webinar, to kind of give some people some pointers on, trying to save that money there. So here's some of the basics of mitigation. As I said, it's the compensatory mitigation is the replacement of wetland areas due to a project where we're going to impact it. And essentially what you're doing at this stage, once you get to this stage, is you're purchasing credits from a private entity that is engaged in restoring wetlands on a large scale or large swaths of land. And there's a assessment between the impacts that you're going to have on the wetlands that you're going to impact for your project compared to that mitigation bank's wetlands that they currently have on their bank. Wetlands that mitigation banks are restored and preserved in perpetuity to offset the loss of wetlands of any potential project area that you may have. Some correlations between mitigation impacts. agencies use complex models to correlate the ecological values lost at the project site to determine appropriate credit amounts. So I kind of touched on this a little bit. Different agencies may use different methods. Different core districts use different methods. Here in Southeast Louisiana, in the New Orleans district at the core, they use a system called the Louisiana Rapid Assessment Method, LRAM for short. Other districts across the country use different methods. Charleston method is a very common one. Louisiana Department of Energy and Natural Resources and the coastal zone, they utilize what they call a WVA, which is a wetland value assessment. All these things are measuring these different methods are all measuring the same factors, the health of that wetland, the hydrology that's present there, the species composition. Those types of things are all measured, but they use maybe some different metrics to measure that and assess it to give it a value. They do this on the mitigation banks as well as the wetland that you're going to impact. So, and then there's a correlation between the two to determine how many credits or how many acres you may have to purchase to offset your impacts for your project. So that's in layman terms how you would explain it. And this is, I just kind of spoke about this, kind of went ahead of myself here, but wetland value assessment, as I said, is used by the Louisiana Department of Energy and Natural Resources. They look at the age of the forest, the species diversity, how it's connected to the bigger system. There may be man-made influences that impact the quality of that wetland. Those are all played into those different assessment methods. So you may have, a couple of roadways or something bordering your site, and it may have disconnected hydrology. That's gonna decrease the value of that wetland a little bit. And all those different factors are weighted differently. So that's the other thing they all look at is the habitat type that you're impacting. Here in South Louisiana, we have a few main habitat types: pine savannas, pine flatwood savannas, bottomland hardwood forests, cypress swamps, and different types of marshes, freshwater, intermediate. Each one of those habitat types have a different value associated with them. We have some that are secure type of habitats. They're throughout the region. We don't see there's no real evidence that these habitat types are going to be, wiped off the planet, such as the bottomland hardwood forest. And then you also have some that are considered like a rare and imperiled habitat type, which would carry a higher quality value than maybe a bottomland hardwood forest, such as your freshwater marshes and your pine flatwood savannas. So all those factor into what the value of your wetland is on your site, but also from the mitigation bank's standpoint. So as I said, with the trying to minimize your mitigation, pre-project planning is the most important part. Site selection should be implemented way before you start some of your design stuff, and that's really where you're going to save your money. In ELOs, we've done this with many different clients. We've done it for roadway type projects. We've looked at 4 or 5 different alternative routes to build an extension of a road to determine where we think our least impactful alternative would lie. Not only from that, but we'd also look at maybe threatened dangerous species, those types of things, to see if there's any other ecological factors that may play into it. But one of the biggest costs with everything is going to be your mitigation cost, especially when you talk about large scale projects. Just here in Southeast Louisiana, bottomland hardwoods, an acre of impact there could run anywhere from 50 to 80 grand an acre of impact. So, and once we get into some of these other habitat types, such as like fresh marsh, it gets in the 6 figures per acre of impact. So on large scale projects, minimizing those impacts and avoiding them as much as possible is going to save you a lot of money in the long run. Some of the things that we've done is you want to get like a JD on the site, a jurisdictional determination. But from a planning perspective, you may not want to go all the way to that point prior to purchasing a property or whatnot, or acquiring that property or right away or something like that. You may want to just kind of get an idea of what it looks like. One of the things that we've offered in the past is a preliminary wetland assessment. That's what we refer to it as. What we do is we look at desktop resources such as LiDAR, soil reports and stuff from USDA, and try to gauge where we think the wetlands may be, and give you an idea of, hey, look, this one looks pretty high and dry, or this area over here, we think we're going to have 2 or 3 acres of wetlands here. So that kind of gives you an idea from a staging standpoint, from a planning standpoint, on which route you may want to take, which property you may want to acquire. And then at the end of the day, you still need to do a wetland delineation prior to getting the wetland delineation and submit that to the Corps to get a jurisdictional determination. When we're doing the preliminary wetland assessments, we don't have the authority to say what is wet and what's not. We can provide our professional opinion. At the end of the day, only the Corps of Engineers can actually say what's jurisdictional, what's not. No, they're the regulatory body. So we would have to submit something to them and get something in writing and authorization back from them. So alternative sites discussion. So this is something that kind of plays out during your permitting process. Throughout the process, they're reviewing different things. But when you get to these alternative site discussions, they want to look at what other alternatives were looked at during the planning process. If you engage with somebody early, a consultant early on, to really look at these alternatives, this part of the process is basically done. You've already done that part, and all you're doing is providing documentation over to the Corps. It makes the permit process so much smoother, rather than jumping into a project without doing this at the very beginning stages. Could save you some money in the long run. So assessment of needed use areas on the parcel. So this kind of goes back to some of the minimization that we talked about at the very beginning. Examine ways to lay out your project a little bit differently. Shifting your maybe your parking lot. Maybe you can make it a little bit longer instead of as wide to reduce some of your impacts. There may be some elements of your project that you can shift around a little bit, turning your project, just a few degrees to the left. You may reduce your impacts by, half an acre. So there's some different things that you can look at when you're doing minimization on site to reduce your impacts. The biggest thing that I've seen with some of this minimizing your impacts is retaining your connectivity of wetlands across an impact area. So you may have a big swath of wetlands that kind of comes through and connects to a bigger system. And your development is going to go right in the middle and disconnect that. So if there's a way that you can shift your project around and create some connectivity there, you're not going to have these offsite impacts, these secondary indirect impacts of wetlands, which are assessed. And you could potentially pay mitigation for that as well. Even though you're not directly impacting it, you're disconnecting it from a much larger system. Other things that you could think about, in some projects, there's no way of getting around it. You're going to impact something. And, and it may be for a good reason. Roadway projects, utility type projects, shifting your project around some of the more higher quality type wetlands, also can save you a little bit of money there. You may have multiple habitat types on the same site. You may have a bottomland hardwood forest that kind of dumps down into a cypress swamp. Impacting the bottomland hardwoods area is a more secure type habitat type, and that could save you a little bit of money there rather than going into the rare and imperiled type habitat. So some of the key takeaways from this presentation, consider your project use areas and plan your layouts, minimize your impacts on your site, shifting your elements away from the resources if possible, maintaining that connectivity across a wetland. That way it's still connected throughout the larger system on the areas that you aren't impacting. And then site selection. It's probably the most important part that I see where you can save the most money. When you're going through the permitting process, you may have to shift your project around. There may be a least impactful way that you can do it. And if you've already designed that plan, at the very beginning, now you're having to go back and modify that. You're not only saving money on mitigation, but you could also save some money on the engineering and surveying portion side of it, where you're not having to go back to the drawing board multiple times through a permitting process. So site selection is very important. I think that's the most important and where you're going to save your biggest buck.
Okay, we'll take some questions now. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box. We do have a couple in there currently. The first is, what is the status of the Sackett decision in Louisiana? Or I guess also the potential effects of that decision.
So what is the status of the Sackett decision in Louisiana? That is a good question because I am not 100% sure on where exactly that's at right now. I know there's been some discussions about some changes in the ruling coming up. The Corps is working on some different language there that's going to streamline the process, reduce some of the gray areas. So we're following that. As we get more information, we may even do a second webinar about that Sackett decision once everything's done with the new regulation that they're working on.
Okay, we also have a question, and you kind of addressed a little bit earlier, but just to follow up, what are the various credit costs for projects? The question is referring specifically to projects below Interstate 10. But perhaps just in general, a discussion about what kind of cost these credits might incur for a project.
So, like I said, I gave an example earlier about bottomland hardwoods. Anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000 an acre of impact. It's all competition driven by private groups that implement these projects. And the prices change constantly depending on the competition, the availability of credits throughout the watershed. So, given certain number, like giving you a hard number on that without running and actually trying to get some of the numbers from those mitigation banks, it's hard to give you that cost. But as I said, from what we've seen in the past, bottomland hardwoods, we've seen it run anywhere from like 50 to 80 grand an acre of impact. Fresh intermediate marsh, we're looking over 100 grand per acre of impact.
Okay, another question. What gives the NOD, I'm sorry, bear with me one second. What gives the NOD the discretion to offset a particular habitat type with a different type of credit than the impacted acreage?
That's a good question. So that can happen. It's rare. And where that happened, and usually why this would happen is they want you to purchase mitigation credits in kind in the same watershed. However, because it's a mitigation banks it takes a long time for them to put these things together. It's not something that happens overnight. They only have a certain amount of credits available to sell. So if they run out of those credits and you don't have enough credits in that watershed, a lot of times what will happen is they'll either push you to another watershed to purchase the same type of credits, same type of habitat type credits, or you may have to purchase credits of a different habitat type in the same watershed. So I've seen both of those scenarios play out.
Can you comment on 404 permits approval conditioned or conditions?
Condition to mitigation credit purchase.
Yes.
So I think this may have been something that was done, years and years ago. Murillo, most of the permits that I've seen, like they're not issuing a permit now until you have your mitigation credits. And there may be some deal in the works or something, but in most of my experience, I've seen, this may have been something that was done years and years ago, but in my experience, in all permits that I've dealt with, they're usually not issuing a permit until that mitigation credit purchase has been done, has been executed.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Feel free to type your question into the chat box if you have one. While we're waiting, I'll remind you again that the presentation has been recorded and will be available for replay on our YouTube channel. You'll receive an email notification when it's up and available for viewing. Please feel free to share with any colleagues you think might find this useful information, or if you yourself just want to rewatch it. If you have any questions, I am typing into the chat box right now Corey's email address. If you have a question that comes up in your mind later, feel free to email him, and he would be happy to get back to you with an answer. I'm not currently seeing anyone typing into the chat box. Give it another second or two. Okay, since it doesn't appear as though we have any additional questions, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Oh, we do have a question. What is the time frame in the NOD for a 404 permit?
Oh, that's a good question. It really depends what your project is. And it depends on what type of permit. So there's different types of permits. You have nationwide permits, general permits, individual permits. So individual permits are going to take a little bit longer. The process is a little more robust. Nationwide permits, if your project fits within that, those are typically a short type time frame because some of the conditions are already built into those nationwide permits. As long as your project fits in that, the review process is cutting down a little bit on the poor side. But for example, say you were doing a gas station and you're going to have an acre of impacts, somewhere south of I-10. I want to expect to see the permit not only from the Corps, but also from, coastal zone, DNR, 6 to 8 months. That's just a rough guesstimate. That's as long as we have all the information up front from date of submittal. It all is based on, what the workload is for the agencies at that time frame when they get the permit application. So that, and also as long as they have all the information, they can, do their review process.
All right, any additional questions? All right, I'm not seeing anyone typing, so I'll assume there are no further questions. Again, Corey's email address is right there in the chat box. If you think of something later, feel free to shoot him an email. He'll be happy to get back to you with an answer. Thank you again for taking your time with us today. This is a monthly series that we do, so you can check our LinkedIn profile, give us a follow, and you'll be notified of our next topic. If there's a topic you'd like to see us discuss, please feel free to post us a message on LinkedIn. We're always looking for ideas and for ways to get people information that they need to make their projects easier, faster, more cost effective. So with that, I will wish you a good rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.